the second week of our seminar 2022. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses of those who have imagined and those who are imagining a better world. And this week, as we're focusing on imagining a church. I am Reverend Darnell Fennell, and I bring greetings from Houston, Texas. I serve as the Director of Social Entrepreneurship here at NBA, which is the health and social service ministry of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. As the one who leads the social entrepreneurship program, we recognize that our program is a space for us to be able to equip, inspire, encourage, and resource people who are imagining wherever they may find themselves in their context as they respond to the cries of God's people. And they seek to respond by creating nonprofit social enterprises that are seeking to solve the issues in their communities. Our seminar is a yearly platform where we're able to expand an educational and inspirational platform to the larger church and beyond, where we continue to engage in the conversation of social entrepreneurship, continuing to invite the church to see the importance of social enterprise and to see that the work of social entrepreneurship is not just something that we do, but rather it is rooted in the gospel and rooted in the life and ministry of Jesus, who takes seriously those whose backs are against the wall.
Amen. And I am Ashley Mayhem. I'm MBA's Social Entrepreneurship Program Coordinator. And as Darnell said, when we talk about this work being rooted in the gospel, we really try to bring forth a definition of social entrepreneurship that really explains that this is the work of the church. And so we want to make that clear when we talk about social enterprise or social entrepreneurship. This isn't just a way of coming up with alternative revenue funds or new ways of bringing in money to the church, but rather our definition of social enterprise is that it is a response to the cries of God's people. It is an entity or an organization that is seeking to meet a social need or correct a social problem. And as I said, we really believe that this is the work of the church. And here at the MBA and in the social entrepreneurship program, we get to do that a number of different ways. We do that through the Sense Seminar, as Darnell shared, but we also walk in conversation and accompany those who are exploring whether or not they should start a new ministry in their church. We walk alongside those who are in the launch or the idea phase through our Sent cohort, which you'll hear more about later this evening. And then we walk alongside those who are currently doing the work and have a separate entity or a nonprofit or integrated auxiliary that is health and social service oriented through our Incubate program. And so it is a joy to come to you in this way. And we hope that you feel inspired and equipped to respond to the cries of God's people in your context. So tonight, in this moment, a couple of housekeeping items. You should have received a handful of video links, YouTube links earlier this week, and we invite you to view those in a time and a space before Thursdays each week so that you feel equipped and inspired. And then on Thursdays of each week, we meet here for an opportunity to engage and chat with our presenters. And so we have a wonderful panel tonight who we invite you as the evening goes on, if questions arise, if you viewed the videos and you have some ideas or questions that have percolated, we invite you to share that through the chat function so that you can engage these wonderful presenters who have shared their heart and soul and much wisdom with us. And we'll introduce them here shortly.
This week's theme is Imagine a Church. Last week, we began our seminar, September, with Imagine a World. And if we are to imagine a world where justice rolls down like a river, if we imagine a world where it works for everybody, imagine a world where a just and loving world, we have to, as people of faith, we have to start by asking ourselves, how are we imagining a church? For the church will be the catalyst. The church will be that agent of change. The church has to be reimagined if we are to live into the reign of God that we are, where we often pray about God's kingdom being with us here on earth as it is in heaven. So we move a step further in the conversation from imagining a world to imagining a church. And we hope that tonight's conversation helps both lay folks, clergy people, seminarians, and all in between to think about, if we are to create a better world, that we must take seriously the imagination of reimagining the church. So we hope that this will be a helpful conversation and a helpful time of dialogue and inspiration for practitioners to think about their work as people of faith in the world around them.
Mm-hmm. And to lead us and guide us in that, we had a handful of just tremendous leaders who have contributed a recorded workshop. And so you've likely viewed that. Tonight in our panel, we have Reverend Ann Jefferson, and she provided us a workshop on the arts and social impact. She works as Director of Community Life and Spiritual Care at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. And in that role, she is one of the campus pastors and has served as co-instructor in the Spiritual Formation for Leadership course. She is the creator of liturgical venture Rhythms of Grace Creations. We also had Reverend Christian Watkins, and she provided the workshop Taking Seriously Young People's Vision. Reverend Watkins is the executive director and campus pastor at Ecumenical Campus Ministry at Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. She teaches in the School of Education and Human Sciences at the University of Kansas and consults as an associate producer for independent film. Her ministry passions include mentorship, ecumenical or interbelief solidarity, and collaborative organizational leadership practices. And then we also had Reverend Amy Butler, and she spoke to a church who risks everything. She currently serves as interim senior minister at National City Christian Church in Washington, D.C. And prior to that, Reverend Butler was the first female lead pastor to the Riverside Church in the city of New York and the historic Calvary Baptist Church in D.C. In 2019, Butler came to believe that something new was needed in the religious landscape, which led her to plant the seeds for Invested Faith, a fund created by donated assets of closing congregation that offers ongoing support to entrepreneurs who are reimagining new expressions of God's work in the world. And tonight we're also joined by Reverend Richie Sanchez, who is the regional minister of the Pacific Southwest region of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And he is also one of the board of trustees of the National Benevolent Association.
And tonight we also welcome our keynote speaker for this evening, Reverend Dr. Mary Donovan Turner, who served as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean and Accreditation Liaison Officer at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. As professor of preaching, she taught at PSR for nearly 3 decades and served church communities as an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. She is the author of Saved from Silence, Finding Women's Voice in Preaching, Old Testament Words, and the God We Seek. We want to welcome with warm hearts Reverend Dr. Mary Donovan Turner as she shares with us this evening.
Good afternoon and good evening to family and friends, colleagues, and those of you I do not yet know. I am really glad we have this time together. I met Darnell Fennell when he came to Pacific School of Religion to pursue his Master's of Divinity degree, in conversations in the classroom and outside and through the Disciples Seminary Foundation. We learned from each other so much about the life of the church and about preaching. I was very glad he had come to sojourn among us. I was pleased then when Darnell was called to be the Director of Social Entrepreneurship for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. What a title. And I was touched, honored when Darnell invited me to give one of the seminars 2022. Thank you, Darnell. Gratitude also to Ashley Mayham, who coordinated all the many details for this event, answered all of my questions, and gave me the information that I needed. I know that there are a host of people behind the scenes, people I do not know, whose names I do not know, who have worked tirelessly to help make this happen. I am grateful. I hope you had time and opportunity to watch the presentations that were pre-recorded by Amy and Anne and Christian. They are excellent, and I commend them to you highly, and we are very glad that Richie Sanchez will also be joining us later in the conversation. When the invitation came to present a SENT seminar, SENT standing for social entrepreneurship or social enterprise, I presume, I became interested in and engaged really by the word SENT itself, its significances and its meanings. And so as I prepared, the words sent and send became the magnet that drew together all the bits and pieces of my thinking. In the early 2000s, when seminaries in the United States were brimming with students, Pacific School of Religion was no exception. We did not have enough housing for entering students. Our classrooms weren't large enough. There was not enough parking on campus, which is not an unusual problem for Berkeley. And the dining hall was always filled to overflowing. It was a vibrant and spirit-infused time to be on campus. We had chapel at 11:10 on Tuesdays. At that time, PSR had a fairly large seminary choir, a director, a dance troupe, an organist. The chapel was always full, at least at the beginning of the semester, not so much towards the end. And when faculty or staff preached, a group of students met with them to create worship that was often very creative, and it was inspiring. One of the many things I loved about the chapel services was the community singing. I think partially I loved it because there were so many people there. I could sing as loudly as I wanted and no one could hear. I have not been given the gift of song. And so I liked the energy of that. But depending upon the hymn or the song or the chant, I was also provided with moments of badly needed quiet contemplation. There was a hymn we often sang in those days. It's found in the Chalice Hymnal, number 452, entitled, "Here I Am, Lord." The first verse went something like this. I, the Lord of sea and sky, I have heard my people cry. Those who dwell in deepest sin, my hand will save. I who made the stars of night, I will make the darkness bright. Who will bear my light to them? Whom shall I send? Whom shall I send? And then we, as a seminary, as we moved into the chorus, I think more with this song or hymn than any other we sang. The words reverberated off the walls and up to the rafters. Here I am, is it I? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go. If you lead me, I will hold your people in my heart. We were a community who felt sent, some of us had some clarity at that time about what we were being sent to do in that particular season of our lives. Some students came to PSR and their thoughts were radically altered about the needs of the world and also about their own talents and gifts and capabilities, what they had to offer. They were in flux, and some really did not know. They had a vague notion of feeling sent, but the specifics of that were still very vague and amorphous. Long-term or even short-term goals had not yet come into focus. And yet we sang as wondrously and wholeheartedly as any group of people can. The words of "Here I Am" reflect the experience of many a prophet, of course, but the writer of this hymn intended for the words to reflect and mirror the experience of Isaiah of Jerusalem as recorded in Isaiah 6. The king Uzziah had died. It was about 742 BCE. The king had died and had ruled for 41 years, so the nation was feeling unsteady, maybe fragile, tenuous. And Isaiah then was in the temple. He was at worship. He saw clouds of smoke and angelic beings, and they were singing these wonderful songs and flying around the temple. That's what he saw. And there was something about the splendor and the glory of that vision and that music that made him immediately feel small and unclean, unworthy, inadequate. Woe is me, he said, I am a man of unclean lips. And one of the angelic beings swooped down, flew down and touched him on his mouth for cleansing. It was through worship then, it was through his experiences in worship that he was made ready to answer the question which the Lord then spoke. Whom shall I send? And Isaiah, frail but forgiven, said, Here I am, send me. We don't know what the prophet thought he was being sent to do, but I suspect that he doesn't at all imagine at first that he's being sent to send scathing indictments and accusations against the people to whom he is speaking. His words are not easy words. They are not comfortable words. He is sent out to observe and really see the harsh realities of the world, the despair, the ways people are not living in covenant with God, the truth about the ways they're oppressing their neighbors. He was speaking truth to power, as we say, but he was also speaking truth to the people, which is sometimes more difficult, I believe. He was just trying to say, God has expectations for the way we live our lives. Hear these words from the first chapter of Isaiah. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rescue the oppressed. Defend the orphan. Plead for the widow. How the faithful city has become a whore. She was once filled with justice and righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Everyone's going after bribes. They do not defend the orphan, and the widow's cause does not come before them. Now, I don't suggest that you start your Sunday sermon with those words, but we admire the prophet for speaking them, don't we? They're not the kinds of words people want to hear. The prophet was sent to deliver the truth about their living. They named the realities and they helped people then think theologically about them. If this is the way we are living our lives, what does this say about our relationship to God? And what is it saying about God's relationship to us? In Isaiah 1, you probably noticed twice the prophet tells us that the sin of the people is ignoring the widow and ignoring the orphan. Once in a preaching class at PSR, I think it was a class entitled Preaching from Difficult Texts, we were talking about Isaiah 1 and the host of texts like it in the major and minor prophets, where the prophet is ranting about the anger God has for the way people were living, an anger which was so great that the mountains were melting and the landscape was scorched. Anyway, we simply read Isaiah 1, and one of the students asked, who could believe in an angry God like that one? And then after a silence, another student said, maybe the widow and the orphan. Of course. What is scathing indictment and accusation to one is the potential for freedom and liberation to another. I've long been enamored with the biblical prophets, not because of the courage they had in their truth telling, and not simply because they would claim their own anger and God's anger about the way the earth was. But I was enamored because juxtaposed to these harsh indictments of the people, there were these glorious visions of how the world can be, or no, how the world will be when the people repent and change and begin living in concert with, aligned with the expectations God had for them. Amazing to me because the prophets remained hopeful. You know these glorious visions in Isaiah. The prophet sees a time when the wolf shall live peaceably with the lamb, where there is this great lavish feast on the top of the mountain and everyone is there because everyone is filled with the knowledge of God. Isaiah sees a nation where justice and righteousness once again prevail, where spears that are intended to bring death are transformed into plows that bring nutrition and life. A time when not a single nation will go to war against another, and a time where the sorrow and sighing of those who are oppressed, it is gone. It's no more. There are 10 people in the 2022 cohort of the Department of Social Entrepreneurship. I read the descriptions of their projects. They feel sent. I would say they feel sent to engage some inequity or challenge or oppression in their local communities. Implicitly or explicitly, they, like Isaiah, detail or paint a picture of a problem in the world as it is. Several of them are working on issues related to children who are not getting the mentoring and support they need. Some are working on food insecurity, or at least healthy food insecurity. Some alternative and inclusive worship, working on liberative mental health practices, working to bring the community together and educate the community so that they have the information and the knowledge that they need to negotiate life. And there are In the descriptions of these projects, either explicitly or implicitly, also what we see in the biblical prophets, a vision of how the world can be better. The prophets said, this is how we are. This is how we can or will be. They imagined a future. But as potentially redemptive as that was, I think the prophets saw that what they did was not enough. There's evidence in the texts themselves that it was not. To tell people what is wrong with their living, as recorded in Isaiah 1, how they have gone astray, is not enough, because here is what we know about the people we share this earth with. People do not change. They do not begin to care or feel compassion because we tell them they should. Today's social entrepreneurs, faith-based entrepreneurs, working both in the church and without, have to paint pictures of how we are and how we can be. They have to enable people to see, to embrace their vision, or better yet, see new visions of their own, imagine them. They have to figure out, strategize, make a business plan, raise money, construct a way to lead people in communities from one place to another. They have to fight apathy in the communities around them and downright opposition, and they have to keep on keeping on. They must help people imagine or recognize why they and we are being sent to make a difference. My goodness. No wonder you are sometimes tired and sometimes discouraged. Have you ever thought much about the word imagination itself? I spent some time thinking about it, and I read definitions of it. One is the creative ability to confront a problem. Well, that's certainly apropos for our conversation this evening. But there's another definition that really intrigued me. Imagination defined as the act or power of forming an image in your mind of something not known to the senses, or never before wholly seen in reality. The power of forming an image in your mind of something we don't know through our senses, and something maybe never wholly seen in reality. I like that, because it threw my mind immediately to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. Did it do that for you? In chapter 11, verse 1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen, maybe not yet seen, not present yet to the senses. Oh, it occurred to me then that imagining or reimagining the world, imagining or reimagining the church is our faith work. It's maybe our most important faith work. It is our faithing, our doing our faith. So the question is, how do we engage the community in this kind of faithing? And how do we open spaces for them to imagine and be faithful? In the early 60s, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was traveling around the country. He was speaking on a lot of university campuses, and he came to the north gate of the University California campus in Berkeley. That is just a couple of blocks from PSR. He was preaching, really, about the war. They began talking about the evils of war and about racism and about all of the divisions and schisms that scar our landscape. And he was saying to the students, do not conform to the ways of the world. They are not life-giving at all. And we know a better way. And he said, don't adjust your ways to the world. Be as maladjusted in this world as the biblical prophets. Be as maladjusted as Jesus. And then he began to talk about creative maladjustment, the ways we can begin to see how the world truly is, and then creatively imagine and begin to mend the world so that it is more healthy and life-giving for everyone. Creative maladjustment. I think he was calling us to faithful imagination. Once at a General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, that is a national gathering of those in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I have long forgotten which one, but someone on the program committee went walking around with a video camera, meandering among the thousands of people who were gathered there, and he would stop someone and he would record their answer to his question, which was, what are the signs of a spirit-filled congregation? Then they played a montage at worship of the many responses received. It was interesting to me. Most all those who gave answers described the spirit-filled congregation as one with open doors, one that welcomed people in, was inclusive and open. What each of the participants said was very important because we were a season in the life of our denomination where we were trying to decide just how inclusive and open we could be. Hospitality isn't it one of our primary theological guideposts? How could it not be when the center of our practices and our identity is the welcome table? It is a practice that is expected of us if our lives are claimed by God. It's easy to rationalize or diminish its call because it demands courage and risk. It is related to who is in and who is out, but much, much more. Some years ago, I was writing a study guide on hospitality for the church. As I finished the draft, the publisher for whom I was writing canceled the series in which the hospitality volume was to be found. That press was having financial difficulties and canceled several projects. And so although it was never published, I learned something from it. I was looking at 11, 12, or maybe 13 biblical texts through the lens of hospitality, trying to discover what they had to say for us in the Christian context. But an interesting thing happened to me along the way. An interesting thing, and I don't know if I can fully explain it to you, but as I was looking through these selected biblical texts through the lens of hospitality, I began thinking about and then writing about some glaring social issue that the church or the nation should be confronting. I was seeing in those texts and through the lens of hospitality issues like food insecurity and immigration, welcome to the LGBTQ community, class, poverty, violence. I learned that engaging these issues is hospitality writ large. That in the church, we are not only to welcome people into our congregations, but we are sent out. We are sent out into the world to offer a wider welcome to the people who share our neighborhoods and communities and our streets. With this message, we are glad you are here in our community. Some people have never heard those words. It was what the prophet Isaiah was asking of the people. Consider the orphan, consider the widow, just in your day-to-day life, consider them. Only a very few people in the montage of the Spirit-filled church described the Spirit-filled community as one where the community was headed out the doors, to understand the community, to listen to the community and find places that needed healing and help. Little mention of straining to hear and see the places that were hurting or broken. Richard Rohr, a Franciscan friar, educator, talks about Christianity as a lifestyle, a way of being in the world that is simple, nonviolent, shared, loving. But he said, as Christianity became established and through the years and for most of its life, Christian churches forgot about the expectations for the lifestyle of the Christian and the Christian community. So he said people could be warlike, greedy, racist, selfish, and vain throughout most of Christian history and still claim that Jesus Christ was their Lord and Savior. He said, we have no time for such silliness anymore. The suffering on the earth is too great. So how do we form and create an imaginative church? One is that's doing the faith work of honestly assessing the world in which we're living and can imagine a future that is different. A church that is sent outward, compelled to be a part, a redemptive part of the community and of the nation. A church that understands, as Howard Thurman told us, that spirituality is not all about me. Spirituality is about us because we're interrelated. A church that yearns for justice, and justice is simply making judgments motivated by a love for the weak and the oppressed. And righteousness, that word gets a bad rap, but it's a wonderful word. It means simply living in right relationship with God and the people with whom we share the world. It is a church that believes what the ancient rabbi once said, it is well with the neighbors of the righteous ones. Think about that. Of course, the righteous ones would make sure that it was so. Do you remember or know a poem by Mary Oliver called The Summer's Day? It got a lot of attention in seminary communities because of its very last line. Most people know only the very last line of that poem, which reads something like this. What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I think that's a good question for each of us. What do we plan to do with our one wild and precious life? But I think it is an excellent question for a congregation. What do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? What are you sent to do? Where are you being sent? What trace do you want to leave on the community around you? What is your legacy? In the 1920s, a community of disciples in South Berkeley, California, purchased a parcel of land north of the University of California campus. They considered the area north of the campus their mission field. There were no churches there. Their mission was to provide support and services for students at the University of California and at Pacific School of Religion, which was across the street. Then the stock market crashed and the country was in the Great Depression. The community was armed with a parcel of land, a set of building plans, but no money to build. They decided to build anyway. They would do work on the buildings themselves, whatever they could, But they would build the church with a high tower as a symbol of hope in the community. They were saying, we will survive. We are investing in this community and we will survive. And they were building not so they would have a place to worship, but so they could pool all of their resources, sell what they had, employ people in the community who had lost their jobs and whose family were hungry. They were sending a message of hope. However we imagine creating the imaginative church, our ideas must somewhere along the way focus on worship. It is the only time and place that we encounter many in our church communities. It is where, through our arts and music, through our prayers and preaching, through our storytelling, imaginations are stirred and souls are inspired. I, of course, having taught preaching most of my adult life, am interested in the possibilities and potential of the sermon in this regard. A complete speech or sermon from the classical perspective is one that teaches something, invites the hearer to feel something, and sends the listeners out to do something. It is an amazing experience when a sermon does all three. Perhaps you can think of sermons that have engaged your lives in these ways. I surely hope so. So much research has been done recently on narrative and story in sermons, and they have the potential to do these three things. Teach, inspire, motivate. Can you think of a story that has motivated and inspired you? You'll find some in the presentations by Amy, Ann, Christian in the stories Richie will tell us. I was inspired by a story found in the volume entitled Craddock Stories. Dr. Craddock tells a story about a time he was at Clemson University and he was giving an evening lecture. And before he started, a student from the university had the task of standing and giving an evening devotional to sort of set the tone for the conversation that was to come. She stood up at the lectern and she had a long yellow legal pad. And she began by saying a short phrase in a foreign language. And then she paused and she said another short phrase in a different language. And after a few times of repeating the phrase in a variety of languages, it became clear that she was saying the same thing over and over and over again, 60 or 70 times in 60 or 70 different languages. And then as she was closing, she said the phrase in German, then French, Spanish, English. She was saying, "Mommy, I'm hungry." And then she sat down. That story helped me remember something I already knew. That's one of the powers of story. Helps us remember something we already know. I knew, of course, that hunger and food insecurity was a global problem. And I knew that there were families and children who were hungry in my own country, in my own community, probably in my own neighborhood. Reverend Dr. Barber told us last week that 52% of the children in this country live in poverty or in low-wage families. This story brought it home to me again in an undeniable way. Stories can do that. They're memorable, incarnational in that they bring our theologies to the flesh. They're revelatory. They help us see something about ourselves. They can create community, evoke memory, teach and melt hearts of stone. The Craddock story spoke to me. It said, "Mary, hunger is at your doorstep. Do something. Do something." And no doubt, stories are important in stirring our faithful imaginations. What do you see when you imagine the imaginative church? I see churches with permeable walls, The wider community welcomed in and the congregants knowledgeable about and participating in the wider community, listening, serving, advocating. Churches, providing both belonging and meaning, as in Christian Watkins campus ministry. Many in the world are desperate for these two things, but let's be clear. There is a kind of hospitality and welcome where this person is simply allowed to be present. But a church that is truly hospitable does not just allow someone to be present, but is vulnerable and open to the person in such a way that the person's distinct, maybe unique gifts and interests are woven into the tapestry, allowing its texture, its substance to be changed. Churches where music and the arts are used to inspire, much as they inspired the prophet Isaiah. Foster healing through honest expression, where they create meaning, where it is known that creativity can be found in anyone, as Jefferson told us, creativity is no respecter of age, race, gender. Where what we know about ritual and spirituality can be a resource in wider communities that have known chaos and disaster. So many of our communities have experienced flooding, wildfires, tornadoes, storms. What is it that we as communities of faith have to offer when there is so much loss and so much grief? And by the way, what do we have to offer to the efforts of making the earth sustainable anyway? Churches where there is a freedom for questions to surface that might lead to new understandings and new ministries. Where prayers are for not only the people inside the sanctuary, but for people of the world, those outside congregational walls, and where the communion table leads us out into the world with open eyes, ears, hearts, with a God-given spirit of hospitality and welcome. Where energy for social enterprise is contagious. A church that acknowledges, an imaginative church acknowledges any interest for engaging the world outside the church walls. I recently was on a Zoom meeting with DOC members and regional staff in Georgia. They were telling me about how in their region it took the interest and the motivations of only one person, a minister, who felt sent to begin ministries to refugees. He called a meeting with Week of Compassion with the region, and then with a nonprofit resettlement agency in the Atlanta area. He called out to disciple churches for volunteers. 40 members in the Atlanta area volunteered to help, and now congregations are giving their time and money to help resettle these families. Started with one person, and we know of one young person in the Northern California region who felt sent to aid the people who were victims of Hurricane Katrina. So many people in the congregation in the region said, it's not possible, we're too far away, but she persevered, and a new ministry was born. In both cases, one person. Where the congregation works with partners in the community who are already alert to social challenges experienced by individuals or groups of people. Maybe work with a cluster of churches or with a regional office that supports entrepreneurial projects in the same way they support new church starts. Maybe create cohorts of churches working in the community alongside seminary faculty or staff knowledgeable in the world of social enterprise, a church that risks its security, its life, for the world around it, as Amy Butler has invited us to do. That knows that while Jesus and his disciples could have created a little cozy community and a safer one, and they could have lived there in and of themselves, Jesus sent the 12 and then sent the 70 out into the world armed with little, only a spirit of hospitality and a longing to heal the world's brokenness. The imaginative church, what do you see. When we were starting our congregation and we were a new church start, we were trying to decide what to name ourselves. And we decided on Tapestry Ministry, so eager were we to be a radically inclusive and diverse community. But one of the names suggested by a congregational minister, I believe it was Bill Shive, was Church by the Side of the Road, which would call us not only to expand our peripheral vision so that we could see people on the margins, but also we just might be a church that would go and plant ourselves there among the people. Recently, in worship, a church leader said that he had passed by a Baptist church in Berkeley, and on the sidewalks, by the side of the road, there were tables piled with food that people in the neighborhood could come and take for free. Conversations were happening there between the church members and the neighbors, conversations about life and inflation and hunger and challenge and survival. The sign said, communion table. They were imagining new understandings, new ways of being church, new ways of faithing. Let's stir it up in our own congregations by asking two simple questions. Who is our neighbor? And what will we do with our one wild and precious life? In the form of a fanciful extended parable, Edward Hayes begins a short volume by telling the story of George. George is middle class, middle-aged. He's described as a non-hero kind of guy. He had this sudden urge, though, to set out on a spiritual journey. A voice calls him to a holy quest, and much to the dismay of his family and his employers, he decides to go, and he cleans out the shed behind the house so that that can be the locus for his thinking and his discernment. Suddenly he encounters an enormous Chinese dragon, at first frightened, but then he was very drawn to this dragon who was so wise and compassionate, covered with brightly colored scales and 1,000 wounds, scars from living. The dragon says, "Can I help you?" He says, "I'm going on a quest." And the dragon says, "What for?" And he says, "I don't really know. The voice didn't tell me. Maybe truth, maybe freedom, the Holy Grail, fountain of youth, or maybe eternal life." The dragon said, "Do you have a name?" He answered, "George." And the dragon said, "Is there anything in front of George? Maybe Sir George." George is not a very impressive name. And he said, "No." And he said, "Well, I'm going to give you a new name then. I'm going to call you capital S, little t, period, George." And George says, "Oh, with all due respect, I am not a saint." And the dragon smiled and said, "Capital S, little t, period, does not stand for saint. It stands for sent. You cannot be a saint until you're sent." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. What a way to close things out. You cannot be a saint until you are sent. Allow those words to sit with us as we move into some questions. I want to invite those who are watching, whether on YouTube streaming or live in our Zoom webinar, to post the questions. While those questions are beginning to unfold, I want to ask the question similar to how you began with the hymn that you mentioned in chapel, "Here I am, Lord," and this idea of "you can send me, here I am, Lord." And I'm curious as we think about that hymn, and I know how when that hymn is sung, that sense of energy that people are responding, here I am, Lord. What would you say are the directions that people understand that place to be sent? Because I think that makes sense. My direction is many of us aren't feeling the sent to be justice seekers or the sent to be agents of change. What would you say your assessment is, kind of direction people understand that direction of being sent?
I think people and congregations understand it in a multitude of ways. I would first say that the question, what am I sent to do, sort of surfaces during different life seasons. So now, being fairly recently retired, I'm asking that question again and trying to have an open posture to whatever might surface. We have a very good friend who is feeling sent right now, lives in the South in the Bible Belt, and he's feeling sent to write editorials about the political state of the nation to his local newspaper. And I have a very good friend of many decades who is being sent for the last years to accompany one homeless person on the journey in his town, and has made a remarkable difference in that life. People are sent to teaching and to congregational ministry and to social entrepreneurship, but I can't imagine that in a Christian context of ministry, of teaching, of whatever they're doing, that the question of what we read in both testaments, in both the prophetic books and in the hymns, in the hymnody, in the biographies and gospels of Jesus, in the wise saying, in the law, that to love our neighbor is primary. It is primary. You love the Lord your God with everything you've got, and consequently, then you love your neighbor as yourself. How can that not be filtered and woven into every vocation and every kind of ministry and every time we vote?
That's good. So I have another question as we kind of continue to ease into this Q&A space. You quoted Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., be as maladjusted as Jesus. And I'm curious, where would you say on this spectrum of adjustment, where would you say that the church as a whole lies, and why?
You know, it's a really interesting question, because it makes me realize that once I retired, I remain connected to the churches in the Bay Area, but I do not have a national sense or even a global sense of how churches are going back about their maladjustment work. I can say here that churches are grouping together. They are cognizant of what is happening in the world. They are asking some new questions, and they are fighting the status quo, I would say. Some congregations, though, come together and they do their work like I was, well, I can think of a lot of examples even in my own congregation. They come together and they do that kind of work in the world together. And in some congregations, it works a little differently in that everybody is active out in the world, and we come together to be renewed and revived, to gain courage and stamina and stick-to-itiveness from the people we share communion with. I would be interested to know how other people feel churches are doing in that respect.
Yeah, we invite y'all. Y'all are welcome to hop on and add your thoughts.
So I'll just say that I think we are living with this sense of regret that we're not the cool kids on the block anymore, and we cannot recreate 1954. I'm seeing that less and less, but that has been something that we've really grappled with, because how can you call yourself maladjusted when you're like one of the principal institutions of a community? Churches are changing. They're not anymore the principal institutions of community. So we're flailing. We don't know what to do. And I loved your question about congregations asking themselves, what is our legacy? Because maybe our work is to follow the work of God in the world, no matter where it leads us.
So not being the principal institution of the community brings opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time, because who knows what could happen.
I certainly think that we have to consider, actually, I think the church, as it is often represented in this time, is extremely maladjusted, but not in the way of Jesus. That there are different ways to be maladjusted. So the call to be maladjusted as Jesus was is the thing that will put us not on the front stage, that will put us on the margins, that will not have us trying to be so connected to the empire and to the notions of power. So I feel like the church as we've known it or thought about it is quite maladjusted, but just not necessarily in the way of Jesus.
So we should say, don't not be as maladjusted as Jesus, but be maladjusted like Jesus was.
Yes.
If I could add, if I could add, jumping in with Reverend Jefferson, doing some thinking about how the latter, maybe about a couple of years ago, where our new church ministry were engaging us in to some thought about how the church is defined, and believe it or not, use the irs.gov to pull up information about various ways on how the church is defined. But Reverend Jefferson stumbled, or is leading us into that exact question, because even an IRS would say that other than churches, that when they talk about religious organizations, that those are the entities whose principal purpose is the study or the advancement of religion. And I would say we've lost our principal purpose, and indeed that to around the study, but also to advance Christ, right? So if the maladjusted way of the world or our communities are to see us, indeed that maybe we are looking too adjusted or too well, and making more things that are important that shouldn't be important, as much as it is going back to our initial mandate, right? Which is to follow in the steps of Christ moving forward, right? And doing some of the work that indeed we need more of.
I think for me,
there you go, IRS. I was just gonna say, there you go, the IRS preaching to us. Can you believe that? No, I'm sorry. Thanks.
No, you're fine. I think one of the things that I experience, I work with several denominations and many different congregations, is that there's a lot of fear. I think that's something that we're all sort of sharing, and that when you make choices based out of fear instead of that space of love, you're going to make a lot of really poor choices. And they may feel more comfortable, they may feel like they fit well, but I think as you continue to sort of follow that path, I've seen that fear often means excluding the voices of young folks, excluding or at least paying lip service to caring about certain topics, but then really being afraid to invest in the mission that we're called to. So I think that for me, when I think about ways that maybe we could do better as church or stumbling blocks, I just feel like there's a lot of fear, a lot of wringing of hands, and maybe knowing the right things to say, but not always making that step of commitment and taking that risk or making that leap of faith. And I feel like I say that over and over and over again. And so I thought, why not share it now? But I appreciate all the comments that have been made, and I think they're really, really important to reflect on.
I think in Amy's, I want to underscore the fear part. What you're observing, Amy, in her presentation tells us, I believe, how many congregations are going to close this year?
4,000.
4,000. And my experience with that fear, the strong desire to keep living and to keep on as a church community and not being sure whether or not you're going to be able to do it, puts people in this kind of energy and life force, oftentimes, not always, that moves them more and more and more toward their center, toward themselves, so that they become depressed or fearful, possessive or protective of what is theirs because they so strongly want to survive, when what we're talking about in the imaginative church is where the energy goes the other way, and it's almost compelling us out into the world, and our work there gives us our meaning, gives us life.
I appreciate how we've kind of moved into this space of highlighting, underscoring the very real fear that we see across the life of our church. And I'm thinking about Reverend Amy Butler's conversation, a church who risk everything. And one of the questions I would raise is, what is risking it all? And in the spirit of risking it all, how do we then define success? That's to Reverend Butler.
Well, I loved, Reverend Watkins, what you said about fear, because that is it. That is it. And it's not just in the church, it's in every part of being human. We're afraid of things we don't know. We're afraid of change. We're afraid of a future we cannot see. And, for us who live and work and worship in these institutions, COVID has just sped that up really, really quick. So all the fear that was smoldering beneath the surface is now bringing us to a point of desperation. And on the one hand, thank you for the gift of desperation, because it's going to make us do what we should have done anyway. But on the other hand, what if we did it without being desperate? What if we said everything we have and everything we are belongs to God and belongs to the support and the nurturing of the work of God in this world? It doesn't belong to us anyway. What a relief. We don't have to worry about it anymore. Instead, let us show up wherever God is working in the world and bring to bear on that work the resources that we have been so gifted with. We're too scared to do that. And then what happens? Those resources go into the hands of developers, or they get wasted, or we just don't know what to do. And there is another alternative. There's another alternative. It just involves swallowing that fear, taking a deep breath, and realizing that God is at work. And the question is just, will we show up?
Mm. So to build off of that, in terms of the pandemic and these significant transition and losses that we've experienced, Reverend Jefferson, what pandemic lessons do you feel that the church has learned that should not be forgotten for the sake of innovation and creativity?
Well, let me say, I think that the lessons were there for us to learn. I think we are still learning them, and some of them we have not yet learned. I wanted to say, in relationship to the last question and thinking about imagination, that, if we die, are we a people that actually believes in the power of resurrection, not just beyond, our physical death, but perhaps the death of our congregations? I mean, for me, the pandemic was a kind of a death of everything that we thought we knew suddenly was in the air, right? And perhaps before us, the greatest thing was that we are not in control. I hope that's a lesson that we never forget, that we are not ultimately in control. We can control our responses. We can understand how precious and how precarious life is, so that what it means to love with a kind of an urgency and a sincerity is critical wherever we might find ourselves. And I was very I leaned into saying the church has left the building, and to really understand that there is a difference between the building and the body of Christ, that the church as the body of Christ can be in partnership with buildings or in locations, but it is the body that is energized to do the work and to bring, I like to say, the beauty and the love of God into the world. I would sometimes say God is virtual, and those who worship God must worship God in virtuality and truth. Where is the Spirit of God? Not just in a building. And so, part of the pandemic lessons are really realizing the preciousness and the precariousness of life, to learn that we are not in control, but we also don't have to be out of control, just, going everywhere flailing, not really knowing. We have to let God be God and let God lead us through whatever wildernesses are yet to come, because there are more. So how can we lean into the power of resurrection? We say we believe in life after life, and sometimes that happens here. So that's what I would say for now.
I appreciate this conversation and this way of engaging one another around imagination and imagining a church. So in the spirit of imagining a church, this question is for everybody. And that is, when we think about churches across our country, do you believe that every church should have a social cause? Every church should have a social cause that they're working toward addressing.
I don't know if I would use those words. Should every church have a social cause? But at several moments along the way preparing for today, I was made aware again of it is ludicrous to think about a church that isn't engaged with anything outside its walls. I mean, I can just not imagine that, as ludicrous as it would be for Jesus and the 12 disciples to form this little cozy group and not be sent out anywhere into the world. So, and it happens in different ways in different congregations, and some, I think it doesn't happen at all, but some, depending on their context, some congregations are good at first, or what I would call first order response to the needs of the people in the world around them. And that is, on the most basic level, if there is a hungry family living on a corner in Berkeley in a tent, that family needs food. And then there are congregations, and the little video we saw last week of Reverend Dr. Barber's congregation will work on that, but also a second order response to the needs of the world, which is that congregation's walking down to City Hall, and they're going to make sure the minimum wage is heightened, and they're going to make sure something is done about homelessness and that sort of thing. So I think, and those churches that are on that inward spiral that's brought about by fear or depression or whatever, to think about how that can be reversed, because then no matter what happens to that congregation, they have been doing work in the world. It's that in large part that gives our life meaning. So I, right after, well, I don't know if this is a good example. Maybe it is. Right after 9/11, they did a study of what was preached in churches the following Sunday. And what they found was, in a sizable number of churches, it was never mentioned. The loss of life, the whatever. So thick were the walls between the congregation and what was happening in the world. So how do we make walls permeable so that people can get in and so that the people can get out? And be sent.
Darnell, I think that is an excellent question, and I wrote it down and I'm going to think about it. So I reserve the right to change my answer at any moment, because it was one I will ponder. I think the question, that I think some churches do have social causes and that they kind of utilize them as idols. I imagine like the programs that have been around for decades that sort of end up being sort of committed out. And so I don't think necessarily the issue is, but 4 people attend now, or it's just the thing that's always been done. So I don't necessarily know if it's the social cause that really is the question, like at the heart of the question. I think what I hear you asking, or what made me think of, is that when we think about really being engaged in the community, we have to understand that some of these causes will change and that it's not always going to look the same. So even if we care about a particular cause, we can't think that in 30 years, if we're going to imagine, it's not a business model in that way. We have to be able to change, and we're called to that. And so I think for me, when I hear that, again, excellent question, I think you have to be touching base with the folks in your community, really trying to understand what's happening, and being able to be flexible enough to respond to whatever the cause is that your church or community is feeling called to, recognizing that we can't do everything. I work, in a small community, and there are so many issues facing our space, and I think a lot about intersectionality, but I also know at the end of the day, we have to sort of choose something that we're doing together that we feel called to. And so I really grapple with this question, like, what does that look like? But I do know that making an issue just an idol and sort of letting it be the thing one committee doesn't feel like enough. But thinking that one community answers every question of all of time sort of misses the point that we're in community with one another and sort of have to listen to one another, and that one church won't have all the answers. And so I think I'm sort of sitting in that middle space, perhaps. And think that there is still a way that we can be responsive, and that we should really strive to do that. And that if we're not, we're going to get into this spiral that Dr. Turner has been discussing and describing. So that's, again, great question. And that's what it's brought to my mind. And I may change my mind in 2 minutes. So.
Reverend Jefferson, would you like to speak more to, you said in the chat?
I think Richie was actually speaking, but you were on mute.
Yes, Reverend Sanchez is speaking. And I'll
Welcome to the world of Zoom. Thank you. I was using the space bar and it didn't work. But hey, no, I would say that indeed for us, having the opportunity to engage the community that's around us, around the needs, but two, asking the questions of what are some of the things that we are uniquely gifted and called to offer. Every congregation has something that they can do, has gifts, has talents to be able to share with the world. Interesting that Jesus only chose 12. And these days, as I work with congregations, we're not looking at the mega churches, through our denominational system as much. But indeed, that we do have things that can be done, and they're uniquely done based on what the Holy Spirit is working with. Interesting when you lead with social cause. Maybe some congregations aren't wealthy in the way of resources, the way that has been offered in terms of the treasurer, but maybe that they have time. The majority of the congregation has opportunity to be able to do some things like offer to care for children or for people in the congregation, to dare to ask questions of other family members on how individuals with time could best support them, and not only for the internal but also for the external, for those that are around us. Connected family members, trying to figure out ways on how we could be better, sorry to co-opt this, but better together.
I would say to that, I mentioned that in some ways I think that the church itself is a social cause. And by that, when I think about the pandemic, one of the lessons that I hope we really learned is that humanity is not made for isolation, that we don't thrive apart from one another. COVID was somewhat indiscriminate, although the disparities were felt differently in different communities, depending on what regular access was to healthcare, information, all of those kinds of things. But COVID was a global pandemic. And so for me, just the notion of church as a connected body of people is sort of a primary social cause, right? So whether we're, looking at how to become more permeable, how to identify the gifts that are within our called community, but also within the communities that we serve or that we are sent to or that we are planted in, we have the opportunity to break isolation, which, and in this current political atmosphere, we are driven to separate corners all the time. So how does maybe our first social cause, whether it has a specific topic or how that moves and changes, become about how we connect people, how we utilize technology to do that, and then what are we able to do or becoming more able to do person to person.
Bill Shive asks a good question in the chat about this distinction between social cause or social justice. And he asks, is it social cause or social justice that the church should be engaged with?
So I have some strong feelings about this because when I pastored Riverside Church, is probably one of the most progressive congregations, or they would like to see themselves as one of the more progressive congregations in our country. I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that church did not turn into a political rally, or that there were not divisions between the environmentalists and the people who were working on immigration. I think what the church has to offer the world is gospel, and that is our social issue. That is our social justice. That is who we are, and that is how we show up. It's gospel. It's what makes us unique. It makes us different than the YMCA or whatever else. It's gospel. And as theologians in communities, I think we have to keep drawing people back to the challenge of the gospel, because Jesus didn't come to start a church. Sorry.
And it would be interesting to ask that question to those who developed the question, right? Mary was excellent to point out that, maybe the issue is not so much the social cause, but that I would say that word cause is probably just a softer way to get someone to want to do something, as opposed to be inward focused, to think about those around us differently, and maybe social justice is the next frontier, right? After you get a cause, to imagine yourself to work indeed to make this kind of difference.
So as we live out what Reverend Butler just shared, the gospel is what we offer, and the gospel is our unique offering to the world. I'm curious, as I think about Reverend Watkins and her video working with young people, do we have an agenda when we are engaging the community around us? Are we trying to recruit? Are we trying to make people Christian? What is the agenda? What are we learning from young people around the agenda around engaging the world around us?
Thank you for asking that. One of the things, I think it's important to explain my context a little bit. I live in Manhattan, Kansas, at Kansas State. I'm a minister there. Of 70 campus ministries on campus, some of them are not registered. I am the only ordained woman. And there are only 3 to 4 ministries that consider themselves queer friendly. So I'm talking about a fairly poignant landscape. But one of the things that my students and community thinks a lot about is that when folks are inviting people to in some of these other campus ministries, there's often a deep agenda of conversion, and particularly it becomes sort of a predatory practice. So I'll be sitting, I look like a college student, and we'll sometimes be sitting in a coffee shop, and someone will come over and sit down next to me and will ask me very point blank, do you believe that Jesus is God's son who died for your sins? And then will engage me in a very, I would say, like, their hope is that it seems casual, but I would describe it as extremely poignant because I'm reading my book and drinking my coffee and was not there to talk with them. And so I can imagine that students, for example, that are coming from across the ocean, who are looking for friends and living in the dorms, and someone walks up to them and just starts chatting, and then 2 days later says, you can't be my friend unless you go to the Bible study with me, which is something that happens a lot on campus. And again, one of the ways that I know this is from working with different committees on campus. I often talk about this with different groups. How do we think about groups that are more predatory? And what do we do? How do we help students who are feeling preyed on? So I wrestle with this question a lot. When we talk about gospel, I think for folks that, for me, for example, I find that very comforting and loving. I feel very loved and welcomed in many faith spaces. especially in the communities I'm used to and comfortable with. But I know and work with students who feel like that kind of language is very hostile, and in the queer community have experienced that as being excluding from being loved by God, have experienced women who were taught that they were qualitatively less able or intelligent than the men in their communities. And I could go on and on. And so I think that, again, in this kind of conversation, it makes sense to me that we talk and use that language, but I spend a lot of time communicating and thinking with folks about communicating the gospel, but recognizing that when some people hear and experience that, they do hear an agenda. And that comes from a place of trauma, and that comes from a place of deep experience. And so we at ECM take that very seriously and try and think about when we want to communicate God's love, we have to think about our community, what's happening in our community. This isn't something that's just coming out of the air. Like, this is something that's people are facing on a day-to-day basis. And so we're very mindful of that. And I try and welcome churches to be mindful of that too, recognizing that may not be necessarily where they exist theologically in terms of feeling comfortable communicating that way. But I do think that people maybe who aren't as familiar with the church, who have not felt loved by God in the same ways that we're describing, hear an agenda in that. And it's an ongoing theological exploration, and I welcome folks' insights. So I appreciate that question.
And I think that is so good, such a good reflection, and so important to think about, because even though I'm in a UCC church right now, radically inclusive, I grew up as a Baptist in the Midwest, very, very much tied to the call of the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all people, so that, wrestling with how to be the people of God without an agenda other than to represent God's love and God's care and God's compassion and God's justice. I think and it's an ongoing, sometimes internal struggle, especially also as people or congregations are clamoring for their life. They may be on life support, but they're thinking about, there's the undertow of, how do we survive, right? So I appreciate the way in which both the question and how you are framing, wrestling with that. How do we just be God's people, being salt and being light in the world for the sake of those who may feel estranged from this God of the quote unquote Christian gospel? Like, what is the good news today? So.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Working with congregations, it's pretty easy for congregations to say who they're not. As you go through the list, well, we're not this, we're not this, we're not this, we're not this, we're not this. And the harder is to really describe, well, who are we? In the midst of such complexities and the varieties of ways that we know now to be church and to do church, you'll find that there might be members, if you don't have an organized system around church membership, you'd be surprised about how many people may be already an elder or a deacon. And no, I've never became a church member. I've never really taken church because of how difficult some of these pieces are for us. My heart goes out to every congregation that when I sit and have the conversation, and it'd be like, "Hi, my name is Richie," and okay, and they'll say who their name is, and we have one question: how are you going to make us grow? How are you going to help us grow? And it always ends up in the same conversation, which is, okay, well, what are those things that make us unique? What are those things that God has caused or has given us? And to lean into that of who we are, some would say we are XYZ church, and couldn't be more inauthentic about being XYZ church. And that is the most frustrating part that you could ever experience, to say that we are, inclusive, and indeed, when you go in, the homogeny is difficult, and I know that's hard to say, but for some of us, when we talk about inclusivity, we have to, really open ourselves to the dimensions and the challenges that make up our community, and to ask hard questions of why don't we, if we are in a community that is made up of maybe 80% Spanish-speaking member or neighbors, or maybe even higher densities of 90%, and then inside we are not reflected of that. So we should have that hard conversation to say, are we the loving church? Are we the church that indeed has justice in mind? Is that our social cause, just to serve ourselves? And I think it's about far time. I understand. I love, as Pastor Amy has mentioned, that there is a sense of desperation, and there is fear, and all of these things that they do absorb our best energies. And for us, what a power in letting go. Like the scriptures. Amy said it, like for us, right? We are people of resurrection, and it's not a bad thing. For us on occasion. I'm trying to think of that scholar who said every 500 years, right? That some things have to kind of be swept out, and we have to just come to it. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the future, even though it's been a busier time than ever imagined. Because we do have. I want to say my predecessors have said that the church decline in the West is probably 10 years ahead of where the East Coast is, and so I can't wait to get back to the East Coast. No, I'm joking. No, but it's a reality. I'm hoping that the work that we're doing is going to be very telling and helpful to those who have not really had an affect the way that we have, trying to come up with ideas and things that we can kind of lean into, and sense of how we could be different, if it is indeed that we're, and I think so. But
So, Richie, even though you just spoke, I'm gonna invite us to like the other side of the same coin here. So, as you heard me share at the beginning, our definition of social entrepreneurship, we believe is very much the work of the church. And so there are these moments where maybe I'm a little biased here, but there are a lot of times where in our work at the MBA, social entrepreneurs seem very clear in their understanding of who they are and how they feel called or how they feel sent. And they know that this is very much faith rooted. And so as we're imagining a church, we recognize that, that's a system. And so we have things like regional ministers. And my question to you is, what do you think are some of the barriers that keep regional ministries from supporting faith-rooted social entrepreneurs, and why might it be important for them to offer that kind of support?
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge is language. Working here in the Pacific Southwest, we do have a history, the issue of legacy, where churches themselves have given themselves to what they thought was important. So we have, you can go on to our site, or you can look up All People's Community Center. You can look up Eastmont Community Center. These are community centers that exist. I want to say All People's will be celebrating 80 years this year. But they started out as churches, and they have these interesting experiences of how their life was really trying to figure out what their communities needed, and hence a community center. And it is my hope to recapture that DNA to do that here. However, I only bring that up because there are slew of different entrepreneurs that are involved on these boards, trying to foster and connect a wider audience, or others that don't speak the same kind of language that the lingo of the church speaks, right? To give you an example, I was invited to speak with, I believe it was the Los Angeles County CEO, who is trying to figure out how their council leaders could adopt to have a faith component, a faith committee that could help the council leaders to be able to do some partnership and some work together, but then to also understand each other. And so the gentleman was actually from Project Impact, who invited me to have this conversation. And as we're speaking to an individual, the issue for us was like, we use the term discipleship in the church, how important that is. But then indeed, for the program aspect in the county, it's a continuum of care, some of the same, I want to say meanings, some of the same efforts, but the jargon, the language is different. For regions, indeed, it's our hope to discover some new ways moving forward. It's not easy. I want to say we have, thanks be to God for NBA and the leadership of Darnell and Ashley and all of the wonderful people that make up NBA, have allowed for grants to exist for those that do have a calling to do some work in the community, to do so, and to have an opportunity to start and to be cared for on how to accomplish these particular things. But I think between region and social entrepreneurs and other efforts, that the challenge, the greatest challenge, is really language, to be able to understand some of those pieces. Now, where this will lead us, I am what they call optimistic, highly optimistic about the potentials for our future, because indeed, as we continue to enter into decline, people like myself are like, well, we already have the design, and we already have the witness and the work that indeed, when if it can't be about the advancement and the principal purpose of studying scripture, it hurts my heart to be about Christ, but then Christ, it was really about his life and witness, right? And so for me, what better way to use our time and our energy and our resources to be sure that the people of God are being cared for. And then, there's jokes that Bishop Desmond Tutu used to say that he makes it a joke. He used to make it a joke where people would come to give the Bible and to South Africa, and then as people would lay down to pray, and then all of a sudden the land was someone else's, and they got we exchanged the Bible. I only bring that up because for us, what a paradigm, right? That even though that the lands and the resources went one way, but the discovery of something much more powerful still fell into the hands of those who were oppressed came about. And so no matter what conditions that you find yourself talking pastors and leaders, you have this incredible opportunity to take what you are experiencing right now and not to put worry and anxiety and all these other things that are absorbing your best energies, if not to be daring to discover what scriptures have for you. And if it doesn't look like you have a full-time job with benefits and pension and all these things secured in it, it's okay. It's giving its way to something indeed that's beyond yourself, and to allow the work of God to continue. Anyway, that's my sneaker preach. Sorry.
Thank you for that. We know about that sneaker preach. in the spirit of optimism and the spirit of hopefulness and being daring, I'm curious from Reverend Butler's standpoint, what risk have you seen taken by churches, congregations, for the sake of good and justice? So we talk about risking everything, but if we could just lift up the ways we've seen that take place.
Yeah, one of the things that it really inspired me to start thinking about this was an article in the Washington Post several years ago about a church called Twin Brook Baptist Church that had about 18 people left in the pews in Southern Maryland. And they just decided, they were sitting on a piece of land that was worth $1 million. And they just decided that rather than spend down all of their resources, it was more faithful to liquidate their assets and to distribute their assets. They chose 15 different nonprofits that they had been supporting for many years. And, it was such a big story 3 or 4 years ago when it happened, but it more and more congregations are being invited to step into ways of thinking about their legacy that include taking risks like that. And I think, again, it's the job of those of us who are the theologians to help people understand that this is not a matter of failure or success. This is a matter of God's continuing work in the world. And I just loved what you said, Reverend Jefferson, because this was a big aha moment for me. People, that the central story of our faith is death and resurrection. Like, what are we saying to the world about who we are if we cannot trust that God will take who we are and who we have been and turn it into who we will become? Because I can tell you, like this moment will pass in a blink of an eye. You and I will be gone long, not very long. And the work of God was going on long before we ever got here. The work of God will go on long after we disappear. So I think it's just I find churches like Twin Brook very inspiring, and my hope and my work through Invested Faith, hopefully, is to invite churches into seeing this moment in their lives as an opportunity to live into the legacy that God is creating for them.
Amen. I would add too that what a powerful combination. I think Mary was had elucidated to that, the ability to invite the regional minister into these kinds of conversations with Amy and many other opportunities. I would be remiss if I don't mention our friends at Christian Church Foundation, Disciple Church Extension Fund, all of those who labor, who have given us this incredible opportunity, even in NBA, their own development team, April Luton, shout out. But opportunity to be able to also to think about the church beyond our local congregation, and to without I want to say the faithfulness of other members, prior, I would not be here. Indeed, this regional manifestation who does so much, and too, I want to say that the general church leaders and all of the staff as well. It was because someone in the past, like Amy's saying, had taken time to think through about the power and the ability to be able to ensure that the church continue to move forward with the difficult decisions that have to be made. These lands, you go back to the book of Joshua, that after 40 years languishing in the difficulty, and then having that promise of milk and honey, and you can go a little bit deeper and go, oh, that wasn't really a good thing. But for us, we do have an opportunity to, like it's already been mentioned, to take resources and to share those for the next generation to continue to do the work work that we are so called to do. So I'm grateful. I'm excited. I hope you are. All is still possible for us because we do have still air in our lungs, gift of life to continue to press on, and thankful for NBA for these conversations.
Well, we are nearing the end, and this has been such a fruitful conversation. And in that spirit of optimism and hope that we've shared, we want to invite you each to this final question. We'll ask Reverend Mary to start us off. But what is one way that you wish that the church supported or resourced social enterprises?
One way, I have experience with several. I'm trying to sort of classify them so that I can think about them more clearly. In our own congregation, people have, we got a message from Leon and from Bill. Bill was once director of the Berkeley Food Bank, or food pantry. So we work there, and our congregational member Peggy has a nonprofit to represent pro bono people seeking asylum, desperately seeking asylum in this country in their varied ways. We support that, but the conversations that I've had with people and the thinking that I've done see that it is so multi-tiered. I'm thinking of Christians, the way she resources projects in her campus ministry by actually giving students funds to reach out in the community. The focus right now is the environment and the things they're doing, and it just seems like congregations together. It seems like regional office. Why can't we support new church starts and church growth? Why can't we support these kinds of projects that make us all aware of the power we have and the importance of what it is we have to bring to the world?
I'm going to jump in because I was really excited about that, Mary. I think for me, I want to stress that emergent adults have incredible ideas, that their vision is often much more clear than my own, and that we have to take seriously resourcing them with the might of our organizations. And for us at ECM, that looks like giving students that participate in our sustainability retreat $200 each semester to envision whatever project they've been working on through our retreat cycle. And incredible things have happened. Our lawns have become places for food. Neighbors come and pick plums off of our trees that are grown and sourced from native plants in our environment so that we're not planting invasive species. Folks are finding ways to really support one another, and in such creative ways that it's hard for me to explain in such a short time. But I want to be clear that there are people that care very much, that are doing the things that we're doing, and oftentimes they're 18, 19, 20, 21, and they just need someone to believe in them and to say, we see God in you. And I hope that is something that we can take seriously as a church and stop seeing young folks as the leaders of tomorrow, but the folks who have the ideas and who carry the gospel very clearly today. And that is so important for folks to take seriously.
So I think I would just, well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of such an incredible group of people and to learn. It's just been really a privilege. And I would say something akin to what what Reverend Christian has just talked about, I think that we have to really expand our vision of who our partners can be. That it's not just the usual suspects, it's not just other congregations, but who do we want to connect to, who may already have resources or they're doing some of the work that we would like to explore together. And I'm thinking also even of what has happened here on the campus at PSR, changing or turning over a lot of the building assets. We have contained the seminary in one building, but we have intergenerational partners. We have a middle school on the campus in the building that was the chapel. We have a school of engineering connected to UC Berkeley in what was the MUD building. And so attempting to live out sort of an intergenerational community on what's often, called Holy Hill, right? What partnerships will come about as a result of that? And even as, congregations, who are we thinking, who are our neighbors? Back to that question, who is my neighbor, right? Who am I? Who are we sent to? Who is my neighbor? My neighbor could be someone that I haven't even imagined yet, but that might be the very person that God is sending, or organization or community that God is sending us to build a world where we all can thrive.
I'll just say amen to everything that I have heard, and just that I find it very life-giving to think about Jesus and all the stories he told about seeds, and about how it is not our business what happens when those seeds are thrown out. What is our business is to open our hands and throw the seeds out and see where they land. And so I hope that more and more churches and individuals who care about living the gospel will hear about your work, Reverend Watkins and Reverend Jefferson, and embrace it as the real work of the church.
I want to add an amen to all of it, and just give you a few congregations in the Pacific Southwest who are indeed living boldly with having social, I want to say, entrepreneurs in their midst doing work. University Christian Church in San Diego, who indeed is taking on their plant and has looked at how to partner with local entities, being able to take what was the fellowship hall and turn that into a different building where different agencies will have opportunity to meet, and doing just an amazing amount of that. So take a look at their work. Casa de Oración, also in San Diego, who indeed during the pandemic has fed so many with the help of individuals who just freely said, I want to serve. They didn't want the Reverend Doctor title or the MD, whichever the titles, which are so well-deserved for individuals, but indeed that spiritual entrepreneurs, as they reach out for support from their regional ministers, to understand that that there is a piece of regional ministries that are doing its very best to ensure that those congregations that are existing have leadership training and opportunity to continue to move forward. But at the same time, that I would hope and imagine that all of my peers or our peers are affirming and bringing confidence and courage to those that might not want the pastoral title. I've been in those kind of conversations where we have met with those who aspire to just do a specific work, and then the quick thing we want to do is to call them pastors. It's not just because you have an idea that's Christ-centered, doesn't mean that you have to be a pastor to live out your call and your vocation. Doesn't mean that you have to go away to seminary. It could just be born in your heart with an idea to be able to make a change in your community, and just to step into it and know that I'm turning into the salesperson here, but Darnell and Ashley are here with that particular purpose in mind, that the church does have the doors open for you to be able to make a change in this world, and not to be caught up by some of the that language that we talked about. You remember how one thing means this and one thing means that, but to allow the regional minister to usher in and help you as you go. If not, and you can always email me, but I want to say, these days we are hoping to augment or build our staff in ways to respond to some of the current needs, like all of you have mentioned so ably. I wish this would, Donnell, you and Ashley are amazing. You created the dream team in this. So if I could afford all of these individuals here, that would be amazing. But no, I couldn't. But I'm so blessed to be part of this conversation. Thank you for the invite.
And we offer thanks for each and every one of you saying yes, being a part of this time, providing your pre-recorded videos that made seminar week 2 possible. So we give thanks for that. Give thanks for your imagination, the work of your hands, and the work of your mind. So we'll close out with some housekeeping. And I believe Dr. Turner is closing us out. Is that correct? No, after housekeeping, Ashley's going to first do few housekeeping things.
Well, we haven't confirmed there, but the one housekeeping thing, as Richie mentioned, and as we stated, perhaps you find yourself in this season of imagination. You have an idea. You want to move forward in responding to the needs in your context. We just want to remind you that the applications are currently being accepted for the 2023 SENT cohort, and that is a 1-year relationship where individuals who are in the very early stages of launching, or maybe even just the idea phase of a social enterprise or a project that is meeting a social need. We get to walk alongside you. There's education, there's peer support, some coaching, some resourcing. And so we want to invite you to apply. And the link for that can be found in the chat here shortly. Reverend Turner, would you be open to praying us out?
Certainly. Let us pray. Loving and gracious, justice-loving God, here we are. We're just so aware of the state of the world, and we're aware of the gifts, the multitude of gifts and resources that lie in the church and in the hearts of those who are determined to walk into the world and bring resurrection when there appears to be no hope for it. So stir our imaginations, embolden our courage, give us the powers of observation and of careful listening so that we can travel out into the world and engage the places that must break your heart. Send us out. We pray in your many names. Amen.
Amen. See you all next week. Thank you so much.